Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And in this lecture, we're going to discuss great art. We're going to discuss the moon. We'll discuss battlefield archaeology and a country of madmen as we follow that outline right up above my head as a framing device to continue to explore the question of what is America, what is American history, and why bother. Now, remember from our last lecture is that there really isn't a single America, but rather there are many Americas, many regionally distinct nations of America. And America itself is this kind of multi-ethnic, multicultural kind of agglomeration of peoples and places and immigrants and Native Americans all bound together in a single nation, and largely bound together in a single nation because we think it should be bound together in a single nation, when in reality, America is a nation of small, peculiar societies. And one of the things keeping these 10,000 tribes of America together is a shared sense of identity, a common knowledge of history, a common sense of pride and accomplishment, common traditions, and a shared mythic past. Our collective memories bind the nation together. America is bound together by a common sense of nationhood. It's bound together by nationalism, patriotism, call it whatever you want. But it is one of the primary reasons to study American history. It's one of the main utilities of American history. In other words, the formal study of America's history helps build the nation, and it encourages this sort of shared national identity. And this is one of the reasons that sort of Americans collectively have decided that little kids need to learn history. Not because, they need to really understand the nitty gritty, details of historical debate or like how the world came to be. But generally we teach kids history in the 4th or 5th or 6th grade. We teach them history to encourage and build a sense of national identity. And this is why a lot of those sort of grade school books and a lot of grade school histories don't get things exactly correct. That's a grade school book of history right there on the left. It is literally a cartoon history of the United States. There's cartoon Indians, there's cartoon pioneers, there's some cartoon Civil War soldiers, there's a cartoon astronaut, all being led by cartoon Uncle Sam. The point of grade school American history is to build a sense of national identity around the concept of American history. And indeed, there is something to be said for that, because American history is indeed glorious. America has an awesome history. And I'm not just talking about, these military triumphs and the sacrifices of soldiers, either in the Civil War or the Revolution or World War II. This is the very famous Marine Corps Memorial in Arlington Cemetery, built in 1954, commemorating the great victory at the Battle of Iwo Jima, the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi. I'm not just talking about America's glorious military past. I'm talking about its patriotic past, its artistic past, because Americans have created fantastic works of art celebrating our glorious history, whether it is the Spirit of 76 or Lady Liberty, Dama Libertad herself, even though she's actually French. Liberty enlightening the world. We don't have a huge statue holding a sword and a shield, but rather we have a lady holding a book of laws and the torch of liberty. These are the qualities that our great public art emphasizes, and American history is absolutely glorious. Almost no other nation has done the kind of things that America has done. America's put people on the moon. The Apollo project is one of the great triumphs of American history. How many other countries have flags on the moon? And the answer is none. All right. American history has created fantastic works of literature, from Moby Dick to Toni Morrison and everything in between. American history has created incredible documents of political philosophy, up to and including the Declaration of Independence itself, which is almost poetic in its rhetoric about the rights of man and all people being created equal. American history is legitimately glorious, and America is itself a nation unlike any other. America is the only nation in the history of the world that is a powerful, prosperous, long-lived democracy. There's no other country like that. We've had the same form of government for for more than 200 years. Almost no country can say that. You take France. France has had 10 different governments in the same period, since we initiated our Constitution. They've had 4 kingdoms, 2 republics, and 3 kingdoms, 2 empires, and 5 republics, all since 1776. There's nothing else like America in the world today, and there's nothing else like America in world history. But American history is not only glorious, American history is also controversial. And there is a lot of debate about American history. And indeed, with the urban riots of 2020, we can see that American history itself has entered the political arena. And these points of American history have sparked major current political debates over the future of memorializing the old Confederacy, over what the Civil War meant. And yes, as part of these political protests, people have attacked statues, declaring that any memorial to the old Confederacy is inherently racist, as the Confederacy fought, at least partially, to defend the institution of American slavery. But sometimes, these protesters don't exactly get their history absolutely correct. You can see there on the upper left, they attacked the monument to the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. They attacked and defaced the monument. And the 54th Massachusetts were a group of African-American soldiers whose heroism was so incredible it opened the army to African-Americans. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie Glory, that's the guys. That's the 54th Massachusetts. So protesters defaced a monument celebrating black soldiers. They also attacked a monument. They thought it was a Confederate. They attacked it because they thought it symbolized racism and rebellion. And this was in Chicago. It was a statue of Abraham Lincoln. They attacked a statue of Abraham Lincoln. But sort of swept up in their fury, they've attacked Catholic saints, dinosaurs, and an elk. They destroyed the statue of the elk in Portland because, well, I don't really know why. But anyway, these points of American history are very controversial. And there are highly debatable, very crunchy parts of American history that people get very emotional about, that people get very wrapped up in, and that matter in terms of modern political debates. And history is itself alive. The ghosts of history and what people did in the past continues to echo into the future. Here's Dory Miller. He's from Waco, so local boy makes good. Dory Miller, the first hero of World War II. Dory Miller was a mess steward aboard the battleship, the USS West Virginia, during the Japanese sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. And Dory Miller by himself gathered together a number of sailors. They saved the captain. Well, they temporarily saved the captain. He was mortally wounded. But they mounted machine guns, and they were one of the few ships that actually fought off the Japanese during the attack on Pearl Harbor, with Dory Miller himself shooting down maybe 2 or 3 Japanese planes as they attempted to destroy the USS West Virginia. And indeed, Dory Miller probably saved that battleship from destruction. One of the first heroes of the first hero of World War II, the hero of Pearl Harbor. And he toured the nation, he raised money, but he wanted to return to the Navy and help the war effort. So he was given a berth on a ship that was torpedoed and sunk by the Japanese, and Dory Miller was killed in World War II. He was 24 years old. And to commemorate Dory Miller, the U.S. Navy is right now probably building the world's most powerful warship that has ever existed. And there it is right up above me. It's going to be finished around 2028, and it's going to be called the USS Dory Miller. The events of the past and what people did in the past echoes through to the current day. History is important. All right, so we've danced around what history is, but let's actually look. What is history, okay? The simplest definition of what is history is the study of past events. That's the most basic definition of history, but it's only sort of accurate. Let's actually dig into like what exactly it means to study past events. And this is our fourth utility of history. History exists as a serious academic pursuit. I mean, look how serious that guy is. That's a serious guy. He's so serious. History is a serious academic pursuit, one that attempts to build better and more accurate models of events that took place in the past, one that attempts to sort of untangle the narratives of our collective memory from reality. History itself is not objective, but it tries to build better subjective models of what actually happened in the past. And historians do this through the study of the historical record. The historical record, it's in all caps, so you know it's important. The historical record is the collection of anything that's been written down about past events. It involves biographies, letters, manifests, accountings. Anything that was written down in the past that survives to the future is part of the historical record. And historians present to the public new interpretations of past events. They sort out myth and legend from actual reality. Now, the historical record is not objective. Histories are generally written with distinct subjective biases. Now, there are two types of histories: primary and secondary histories. Primary histories are contemporaneous accounts written down by people who wrote down the events of their lives, the events that they themselves experienced. Primary histories have the benefit of being first-hand witnesses to events. They have the benefit of being of involving the people who directly lived through important historical events, through events that can be both incredibly dramatic, events that can be incredibly quotidian. Primary histories are people who saw something and lived their lives. The weakness of primary histories is like they're living the history. They don't know exactly how it's going to end, so they don't know what's important and what's not important. Primary histories are basically balanced off with secondary histories. Secondary histories are accounts written by individuals who study primary histories, and they may or may not have lived through those events. Now, secondary histories generally have the benefit of time and distance. Like they know what happened in history. They know how a series of events played out. So they know what's important. They know what's not important. And they can write about why something took place over time. For example, let's take two books. Caesar's The Gallic War, which was written between 58 and 49 BC, and Edward Gibbon's classic book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was published between 1776 and 1798. The Gallic War is a primary history. It was written by Julius Caesar himself, and it's an account of his wars against the Gallic tribes and the conquest of Gaul, as Gaul is added into the Roman Empire. And Julius Caesar is well on his way to becoming the dictator of the Roman Republic. And it is a primary history. Julius Caesar was there. He witnessed those events. He commanded armies in the field. He defeated Vercingetorix and conquered Gaul for the glory of Rome. That's a primary history. Edward Gibbon, on the other hand, wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire picks up, it starts with the Roman Empire at its height in the 1st century AD, and then follows 1,000 years of history until the final extinguishment of the last spark of the Roman Empire in the 15th century, as Rome goes from this all-encompassing universal empire that rules a huge portion of the world to a battered, besieged city-state clinging to its final glories. It is, of course, a secondary history. Edward Gibbon did not live the events of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, even though he writes it like he's there. And in fact, he couldn't have actually lived those events. The history covers 1,000 bloody years. It would be incredibly creepy if Edward Gibbon lived that long. I don't want to read a book like that. It's creepy. Here we go. The Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, generally considered the best biography ever written by an American president, in which U.S. Grant writes his own life story, starting out in the Midwest, going through his military career, through the Mexican War, up his his struggles with alcoholism, his attempts to have a shop that fails, the outbreak of the Civil War, and then his ascension to, the commanding general of all U.S. forces, and eventually the presidency himself. And literally, he's writing the last few chapters of his own memoir while he is dying of throat cancer because he smoked cigars his whole life. It is considered to be one of the greatest works ever written by an American president, the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. Here's my question. Is it a primary or a secondary history? It's not a very hard question, but oh well. All right, right above my head is a Civil War, a narrative by Shelby Foote, which was published between 1958 and 1974. Shelby Foote's The Civil War is considered the best multi-volume coverage of the Civil War. It covers the entire American Civil War, from the outbreak of the Civil War in South Carolina that involves battles all the way from Virginia to Oklahoma to Tennessee, the huge battles that took place in Texas, the naval clashes along the coast. He even takes us all the way to the naval battles in the Pacific Ocean as the Confederate commerce raiders ranged across the world. Is it a primary or a secondary history? That's the question. Not a hard question. Not a hard question at all. This class will make use of primary histories. I have a number of primary histories that are slated for this course, from Diaz del Castillo's Conquest of New Spain, from A True History of the Captivity and Restoration of Mary Rowlandson, A General History of Virginia by John Smith himself, Solomon Northrup's account of his 12 years on a southern plantation, 12 Years a Slave, and the beautiful poetry of Phyllis Wheatley. And this is just some of the primary histories I will use in this class. I will use a large variety of primary histories, and these will become available in the various modules. But what I want you to do is, none of these will be required, but what I want you to do is to focus on the ones that interest you. If you're interested in, a soldier in Cortez's army fighting the Aztec Empire, there's Diaz del Castillo. If you're interested in Mary Rowlandson, a Puritan minister's wife, captured by the Wampanoag Indians and dragged across the forests of New England during the events of King Philip's War, there's Mary Rowlandson. If you're interested in these very early colonies in Virginia and John Smith himself, there's A General History of Virginia right up above my head. If you like poetry, there's the first great American poet, Phyllis Wheatley. If you want to know what it was actually like to be an American slave growing cotton on a plantation, Solomon Northup is your boy. And we're going to have more of these. There's going to be a supplementary exercise on music. There's going to be one on the most famous sermon in American religious history, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. These primary histories should interest you, and you don't have to do all of them. You don't really have to do any of them, but you should do the ones that interest you, whether it's poetry, literature, music, religion, war. Do the things that interest you, and it will help your grade. And in addition to the secondary histories, in addition to primary histories, we're also going to make use of archaeology in this class, because, I am an archaeologist. Historians also make use of archaeology. Now, archaeology, it's in all caps, so you know it's important. Archaeology is the scientific study of the human past using the archaeological record. Now, the archaeological record itself is the extant material culture of past peoples. In other words, the archaeological record is the stuff that is actually located in the ground. In fact, that's actually a photograph of one of my excavations down in Guatemala. Now, unlike the historical record, which is all of those primary histories, archaeology is objective, whereas primary histories are subjective. Archaeology, in fact, often serves as an important objective corrective to what is a subjective historical record. For instance, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a fight that took place in southern Montana in 1877. And General Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry was chasing the Sioux and the Cheyenne Nation across the west when suddenly the two Indian nations turned around, surrounded, and destroyed the 7th Cavalry. killing General Custer himself. Killed his younger brother, too, who had won the Congressional Medal of Honor in the Civil War. And this is the sort of mythic history of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This is what the history books said about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and this is why this painting was painted. And it shows the 7th Cavalry. They killed their horses to build a wall out of their horse flesh to hunker down beside it as the Indians rode around and around the doomed army, shooting at them. There's the bugler calling his last bugle, and in the center, George Custer himself, standing to the last, a hero to his men before the final collapse and destruction of the 7th Army in Custer's last heroic stand. But that's not what the archaeology says. It's not what the archaeology says at all. The account of the last stand of the 7th Cavalry is a story that was essentially kind of invented in the wake of the defeat at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And nobody really knew what happened. After all, there were no survivors from the 7th Cavalry. And Indian accounts of the battle tend to be these very, very confused accounts. And they didn't really know what was going on because most of them were, busy shooting or busy not being shot. It wasn't until the late 20th century and early 21st century that archaeologists were able to revisit the battlefield and sort of reconstruct a series of events. Now, nobody had really visited the battlefield in the 100 years since the battle. I mean, it's after all, it's just prairie land. People generally grazed cows on it and occasional herds of bison, but there was never any real development of the Little Bighorn battlefield. And in the 1990s and in the 2000s, a major effort was made to reconstruct the battlefield and to try and understand what happened. And what happened was they actually were able to reconstruct what happened during the battlefield because they were able to recover the spent brass of the soldiers that was still there. In fact, you look at that picture right up above me, there's one of the archaeologists holding one of the spent brass from the Springfield trapdoor rifles that the U.S. Army was using. And because each of those rifles was hand assembled, the firing struck each brass shell in a slightly different place. In other words, you could study the spent brass from these rifles and recognize every single rifle produced a slightly different signature on the spent brass that was ejected after each shot. And if you mapped all of those together, you could literally trace the movement of a single soldier across the battlefield of the Little Bighorn. And that's what they did in a series of maps. And if you look at that map on the left, the little arrows or bullets that are in the side of this hill, the black triangles are spent brass, which have the same sort of signature. So they all were fired from the same gun. And you can literally see what happened to this soldier as he is at the bottom of the hill. He fires and reloads, and he starts to step back. And you can see he kind of pauses along halfway through the hill, firing and reloading, firing and reloading. He does this 4 times. And literally you can see the bullets start to pile up in the hill around him as the Native Americans are continuing to shoot at him. And he decides that, retreat is the better part of valor. He retreats a little farther up the hill, fires and reloads, expending another cartridge. And again, as the Indian bullets are continuing to rain all around him, he makes it to the top of the hill, fires and reloads twice more, and then his body is at the top of the hill where he is killed. And they were able to do this. And what the battlefield that they reconstructed, the events that they reconstructed from the archaeology of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, wasn't a heroic last stand of brothers in arms in a circle, protecting each other's back, but rather a highly confused fight in the tall grasses of Montana, where most of the people that were shot were probably shot at extremely close range and didn't even see the people that hit them. And finally, there is a final collapse, and the last gasp of the 7th Cavalry wasn't brothers in arms blowing their bugle heroically dying for the American West, but rather confused, frightened men fleeing down the side of a gully, mostly shot in the back by the Indians who pursued them. It's a very different image of what happened in that battlefield. Not a heroic last stand, like history argued, but rather a confused massacre, which is what the archaeology suggests happened. This is why archaeology serves as an objective corrective on a subjective historical record. And in addition to this, historians rarely agree on what actually happened in history, and arguments necessarily arise within historical circles. As a scholarly discipline, history actually permits one to compare very different opinions on the historical record and to think critically about those differences. And this is why this is going to be a different class from your high school history class, which basically taught you a single series of events. I don't do that. I teach you debates. I teach you historical discussions, historical arguments, and a great deal of arguments occur about the past. And here's just some of them. I mean, should the US have dropped the atomic bomb on Japan in 1945? Should America have intervened in the Vietnam War in the 1960s? What actually caused the American Civil War? Was the American Civil War centrally about slavery? Yeah, it was actually. But anyway, it doesn't matter. History itself, as a scholarly discipline, is filled with different historical arguments. As different historians and different archaeologists argue with each other and argue about these sort of historical events, argue about these events that took place in the past. And in addition to studying the past, there are actually entire differing schools of history. There isn't a single type of history, but rather there are many different histories. History is not an objective study. There are different kinds of histories. Here's just 4 of them I've listed, and I'll describe these to you very, very briefly. There's something called Whiggish history way out there on the left. And Whiggish history is this like relentlessly positive history where everything is just awesome. Everything in the past was great. Everything is just getting better. And you see Whiggish histories. It's things like Triumph of America, the rise of a great nation. These are all Whiggish histories. It's where everyone sacrificed in the past to make the present absolutely awesome. And you're going to work hard and make the future even more spectacular. That's Whiggish history. And then you have sort of the mirror image of Whiggish history, which is Marxist history. Well, Marxist history argues that history is nothing more than the grinding competition of competitive class groups, and history is nothing but the story of exploitation and oppression, and in the past everything is awful and everything is just going to get worse. That's Marxist history, which is right there. And then you have, heroic histories. This is very popular. This is what you find in like airport bookstores. Heroic histories basically focus on a single individual: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. And basically heroic histories argue that really only a few really awesome people shape history. That most of the Americans in the past were basically just like flavorless tapioca. And then you have a few just awesome people come along and change history. Or you have a straight up economic history. There's capitalism in America. There's barely any people mentioned in that book. In an economic history, it's all about money. And it sees the history as being shaped almost entirely by money. Only money shapes history. People barely matter in a lot of these hardcore economic histories. It's just all about the money. And to some extent, all of these histories have elements of truth into them, but not all histories are valid. Some history books are just complete trash, and some history books are really good. But understand that there isn't a single type of history. There isn't a single historical narrative. And this is the problem with teaching history. This is the problem with history classes. Is that the easiest way to teach history is to build this kind of meta-narrative and just see how historical facts fit into this meta-narrative. But that does a great disservice to students, because that's not actually how the discipline of history works. It's not certainly how events in the past work. And I have a pull quote I'm going to use, but I want to make sure you guys can actually see it when I read it to you. So I've sort of enlarged it above my head, and I want you to pay very close attention to the pull quote from this Atlantic article, the problem with teaching history, because this explains why I'm teaching this course the way I am. And here it is. And you maybe you even want to put this quote in your notes. I don't know. The passion and urgency with which these battles are fought reflect the misguided way history is taught in schools. Currently, most students learn history as a set narrative, a process that reinforces the mistaken idea that the past can be synthesized into a single standardized chronicle of several hundred pages. This teaching pretends there is a uniform collective story, which is akin to saying that everyone remembers events the same. Yet history is anything but agreeable. It is not a collection of facts deemed to be official by scholars on high. It is a collection of historians exchanging different, often conflicting analyses. And rather than vainly seeking to transcend the inevitable clash of memories, American students would be better served by descending into the bog of conflict and learning the many histories that compose the American national story. This is why I'm not going to tell you, Columbus was a hero or a villain. I'm not going to tell you who won King Philip's War. I'm not going to tell you that the Civil War was either a tragedy or a triumph. I'm going to give you the question, provide you with all the facts, and as students are going to use your brains, you're going to use your head meat to build your own answers to these questions. And we've started this off in a very, very gentle way. What is America? What is American history? And why bother? And you should have in your notes everything you need to answer that question. I gave you 3 definitions of America. I gave you those straight up and very explicitly. I gave you 4 utilities of American history. You should have them in your notes. And if you don't have them, pay close attention to what I'm about to say. 1, history serves as a corrective to an imperfect collective memory. And if this question appears on an essay test, which it might, what is America? What is American history? And why bother? You write this down. You say, history serves as a corrective to an imperfect collective memory. And then you explain what that sentence actually means. 2, history helps explain why the country looks the way it does. That's our second utility of American history. And in an essay question, you would put that sentence down, and then you would explain what that sentence means. 3, the study of history helps build the nation, and it encourages a shared national identity. And if this was an essay question, you would put that sentence down and then spend about a paragraph explaining what that sentence actually means. 4, history is a serious academic pursuit, one that uses the historical record to build models of events in the past, to sort of untangle the narratives of our collective memory from reality. And then you would spend a paragraph, like all of the others, explaining exactly what that means. And with all of that together, you should be able to have an answer to Henry Ford. History isn't just bunk. History serves a function. But other than those 4, one of the main functions that history serves is it gives us a sense of where we are in the world. It provides us a sense of why we are in the world. And this is why I'm going to use the great historian George Santayana's quote. George Santayana has a lot of great quotes. He's like one of the greatest American historians of all time. And he was talking about the importance of history and why we learn history. Because if we don't know where we come from, we don't know where we're going. And a country, this is his quote, a country without memory is a country of madmen. If we don't know our history, we don't know why we're here. And this will collectively drive us insane. And no one wants to live in a nation of madmen. And when a nation forgets its history, it ceases to exist. And we're going to climb right into a grand overview of American history in our next section, a very brief little lecture on the huge pageant of American history itself to explain why you are sitting where you are. And I will see you there.